There's no question that one of the most hotly debated and contested issues right now in this country revolves around the Confederate flag, the good old stars and bars, and what that flag symbolizes and what it represents and what its place is in current American society. Now, many people will argue that the Confederate flag, the good old stars and bars, is a symbol of the South's racist past and this country's racist past as a whole. They find it to be a reminder of the days of slavery, racial oppression and segregation, and what have you. Whereas you'll have those on the other side of the fence that will sit there and say that this flag represents Southern pride and Southern heritage, and that it was twisted to represent those things, but doesn't actually represent those things, and nor does it from a historical standpoint. And with what happened in South Carolina with the massacre at that black church, it's not a surprise that this issue bubbled to a head again, because this is something that's been simmering underneath the surface for many, many years. And in many ways, it feels like it's a battle between the North versus the South. In a lot of ways, it's one of these types of issues that make you think that the Civil War still has wounds that run very deep in this country 150 years after the Treaty at Appomattox. But here's what I can say, is that we know that the defenders of the Confederate flag and it being flown above state capitals and being represented or being the state flag will say the following: that it was never the official flag of the Confederate States of America. They'll say the Civil War was about states' rights, not slavery or the institution of slavery. They'll say that that flag represents Southern heritage, Southern pride. It's a tribute to those from the South who fought and died in the Civil War, fighting for their states' rights, fighting against the oppressive rule of a strong central federal government, fighting against the North, trying to impose their way of life upon the South. And they will say that taking down the flag from state capitals, from courthouses, taking it out of state flags would be an infringement of freedom of speech and expression, and it would represent a real slap in the face to those who view it as a representation of Southern heritage and Southern pride. Well, here are some inconvenient truths for the people on that side of the fence. Now, first and foremost, I will say they are technically correct when it comes to the stars and bars. It never was officially the flag of the Confederacy. That is true. It was a portion of it, and it became kind of the mascot or logo for the Confederate States of America. But the stars and bars, the way we know it today and have known it for years, was never actually the official full-on flag of the Confederacy. It was a flag that was flown by certain Northern Virginia regiments, during the Civil War in battle. But the Confederate States of America as a whole, no. It never was the national flag. It was a part of it, but it was never the full, entire, complete flag. And that is true. But after that, the arguments from the pro-Confederate flag, or in this case I'll say pro-Stars and Bars crowd, pretty much fall apart. There's a big difference between public free speech and private free speech. Somebody wants to sit there and fly the Confederate flag over their home, so be it. Somebody wants to sit there and wear a Stars and Bars shirt, so be it. That's something that's protected by the First Amendment of the Constitution in terms of individual free speech. Flying it in public places that are supported by tax dollars, those are things that are not necessarily protected by freedom of speech and freedom of expression and the First Amendment. So to sit there and say that it is a falsehood. What is also a falsehood is to sit there and continue to perpetuate this revisionist history, this flat-out lie narrative that somehow the South seceded from the North, from the Union, in order to protect their rights and their states' rights because they were being trampled upon. This is one of the biggest loads of BS that have been perpetuated upon our American society over the past 150 damn years. The simple fact of the matter is the Civil War from the South standpoint was wholly, completely, and totally about the institution of slavery, protecting the institution of slavery, because that was the number one economic issue of the South. It was slavery. And while people today want to sit there and try to spin it and say that it was about things other than that, you could go take a simple look back down memory lane, go back through history books, look at historical evidence that clearly indicates that the Civil War from the South standpoint was fought from the perspective of wanting to protect slavery. This is not something that can be argued or debated, and if you do, you are a moron. I'll go to Jefferson Davis. He was the president of the Confederate States of America. I would think he would have a pretty good idea of why the South seceded from the North and why the Civil War was fought from the South standpoint. And he referred to the fact that it was to protect the institution of slavery and also avowing the superiority of the white man. You go through other states, whether it be South Carolina or Texas, when they seceded, same damn thing. From the South standpoint, this war was about slavery. It wasn't about states' rights because, in fact, if anything, they were against states' rights. They were rebelling against, in part, some northern states that were refusing to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act of the 1850s. So some states were actually exercising their rights they felt as states to not enforce that law, because they didn't agree with it, didn't believe in it, and the South was rebelling against that because they were trying to keep slavery. Slavery was the reason the South seceded and fought the Civil War. This revisionist history shit must end, because if you argue anything other than this, you are an idiot. And when we come to the heritage of the South, just because it's the heritage or the history of the South doesn't mean that it necessarily represents the people of today. But we can't heal and we can't grow and improve and move on from the past and learn from the past unless we actually acknowledge the simple truths of the freaking past. You want to talk about the South's heritage? It's racism. It's slavery. An entire segment of this country seceded away from the Union to protect the institution of slavery in defense of the subjugation of other human beings, subverting an entire race of people to outright racism and treating them like they were freaking dogs, like they were property. When we talk about the South and their heritage and Southern pride and this and that, a lot of times that's something you hear Northern idiots talk about because they don't have any clue what the hell they're talking about. The whole thing about the South trying to fight for states' rights. It was states' rights only when it was convenient. And in this particular case, they viewed it to be convenient because, again, they were trying to protect the institution of slavery, God blessed. And most importantly of all, if we really truly want to talk about the South's heritage, in particular during the Civil War, what they did was treason. The South and the states that seceded from the South, or in the South, from the Union, were what we would classify as traitors. And the fact that there are still people today that consider this a source of great pride, that there are people that want to celebrate this, like this is something to be proud of, absolutely astounds me. What the South did, frankly, is no different than something like a Benedict Arnold did. They both committed treason. They were traitors. Yet you don't sit there and drive all throughout the country and see all these monuments to Benedict Arnold. We don't see names of highways and buildings after these Southern generals and these Southern leaders. You don't see monuments like here in Richmond, Virginia. You've got an entire freaking Monument Avenue. Statues for Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee. What the hell are we celebrating these damn traitors for? Treason is something that is specifically against the Constitution of the United States, and as such is outlined in the Constitution as to what defies treason. The South was full of traitors. That's your heritage. That's your history. It doesn't mean that you are today. Accept it. Own up to it. Period. To say it's anything other than that is ridiculous. So if you want to sit there and fly the stars and bars and sit there and talk about how this doesn't represent that in any way, shape, or form, well, to be fair, it was a part of the Confederate flag. It does in some ways represent the Confederacy. Yes, dumb dicks, it does represent all of those things. And in particular, if we want to sit there and say that the stars and bars do not represent racism in any way, shape, or form, the stars and bars became prevalent in particular as its own standalone flag in the 40s and 50s, in particular because of the Dixiecrats, which was a Southern party that sprung up in part because they didn't agree with where the Democratic Party was going in terms of the views of protecting Jim Crow segregation. The Dixiecrats supported Jim Crow segregation. They believed in publicly sanctioned racial discrimination and segregation. And their banner that represented this were the freaking stars and bars. And over the years, it became a symbol for groups like the Ku Klux Klan and other pro-segregation groups. If those groups are using it to represent how they feel, then what the hell does that mean the flag represents? You can't just pick and choose when it's convenient for you here. It became a symbol of racial discrimination and segregation and prejudice. Fucking racism! The stars and bars represent racism, segregation, discrimination. Whether it dates back to the Civil War or the 1940s, 50s, and 60s doesn't fucking matter. That's some freaking proud heritage to have and want to hold up, isn't it? But this comes down to the whole thing of revisionist history, as I referenced earlier, when it comes to the Civil War. And there is revisionist history all around. But before I say that, let me say this. Some point in time, somewhere along the way, it's almost like the South is still trying to fight the Civil War in some ways, and they don't like to be told what to do by the North. It's not like the North was always that much better, frankly, so I could kind of understand that. But then on the flip side, it's like the North still tries to appease the South and tries not to step on their toes or hurt their feelings too much. And as a result, we sit there and name forts and military installations after these Southern generals, these traitors. We have Jefferson Davis Highway here in Virginia. We name it after the representation, the ultimate representation, the president of the traitorous Confederate States of America. How in the hell did this happen? How in the hell did this whole narrative about states' rights come in when it wasn't about states' rights other than the states' rights to continue to protect the institution of slavery? And in fact, in part, they were rebelling against other northern states, inducing their own states' rights. Somewhere along the way, the North became afraid of the South and was afraid to tell how it really was. But on the flip side, when you look at it, there's a lot of revisionist history from the North's perspective when it comes to the Civil War. You know, we could talk about the South and how slavery was the number one economic issue, and that especially once the cotton gin was invented in the late 1790s by Eli Whitney, that the importance of slavery exploded exponentially, and it was the worst thing that could have ever happened to this country, and there could definitely be some major arguments made for that. But as much as we could focus on the South and blame the South and talk about the South, again, for shit that happened 150, 200 years ago, that my ancestors weren't even here for, weren't even a part of, mind you, and many of yours weren't either. You know, we don't talk about all the northern banks that were investing in these plantations, in these businesses that profited off of slave labor. You know, slavery was not a South-only issue. It was a northern issue too. In particular, these northern banks and northern institutions that were profiting off of slavery. This was a national issue. It just wasn't a regional issue restricted to the South and Southeast of this country. Ultimately, again, when you talk about the Civil War, from the South standpoint, it was about slavery, period. Stop all the other bullshit. And when it comes to the North, there was only one reason that the North fought the Civil War. That was to preserve the Union. It was not to sit there and try to abolish slavery. It was not to fight against slavery. It was try to bring the treasonous states of the South back under the fold, because a house divided against itself cannot stand, which means other things too, I understand. But it was a war about preserving the Union, not slavery. And in fact, when it started to shift, as you got into late 1862, 1863, it only became about slavery in part for two things. One, to serve as propaganda to pump to the people of the North as a continual justification for this bloodbath, but also, two, as a way to try and undercut and undermine the South, so that way they hoped the slaves would take up arms and rebel and revolt, get out of the South, and come fight with the North. So even when it became about slavery, there were ulterior motives in play. And we talk about the South and all these evil things, but you look at the North. All this praising of Abraham Lincoln and the martyrdom that we've given him. Here's a guy whose administration committed numerous constitutional violations during the Civil War, all in the defense of this is wartime, this is different, writ of habeas corpus, what have you. And let's not even talk about the war crimes of people like General Sherman in his march to Atlanta. And other war crimes that were perpetuated by the North all throughout the Civil War. Sure, there were war crimes on the South as well. But we also fundamentally get to this point, and this is something that has been pumped down our throats for years about Lincoln and what a great man he was and how visionary he was and how much he was a man of the people and he believed in the rights for everyone. We portray him as this guy, this big booming voice, this commanding presence. We don't talk about the fact that he actually talked like this with a nasally kind of Bronx-sounding tone, and the fact that he was a freaking white separatist and white supremacist, not somebody that believed in equality for all. If anything, the only reason he wanted to end slavery, and this is historically documented as well, it's just something that isn't talked about, it's because he wanted to free the slaves so that way he could send them back to freaking Africa where he felt they belonged, so that way he could create a white utopia. And his whole thing about a house divided against itself cannot stand. He wanted to end slavery, again, to protect and preserve the Union, so that way he could send the blacks back, in his opinion, where he felt they belonged, where they came from, because they couldn't possibly measure up to the white man and all of its greatness and awesomeness. So revisionist history is all abound throughout the Civil War and the documentation and the historical records of the Civil War. But again, when it comes to the South, they're a big part of this too. The Confederates were traitors. They're not worthy of hero worship. We don't sit there and say these great things about the Rosenbergs. We don't sit there and say great things and erect statues and monuments to Benedict Arnold, at least I don't believe. So why do we do it to all these Confederate soldiers and these Confederate generals and these Confederate leaders? They're traitors. They committed treason. That's something that, in theory, you would think that you wouldn't be celebrating. What do you want to bet today that if certain segments of the American population tried to do the same type of thing, people, especially in the South, would be incredibly opposed to this? How could you sit there and do that? It'd be the same damn thing your fucking states did 150 years ago, and that's a fact. The Civil War was about preserving the Union versus slavery. It was not about an oppressive North versus this little old South that was getting fucked over in every way, that just wanted to protect their individual rights and wanted to have the right to live their lives the way they wanted to. No, it was about them living their lives the way they wanted to, so that way they could own slaves. Period. End of discussion on that. And when we talk about the stars and bars, whether you want to refer to it in a somewhat historically inaccurate context of it being the actual flag of the Confederate States of America, which, again, as I mentioned, it never technically fully was, or you want to talk about it during its time as being the flag that represented the Dixiecrats and the pro-segregation movement of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and even to this day in the South, to a much lesser degree, obviously, than during that time frame, any representation of Southern heritage, history, or pride that comes out of the stars and bars is not good. It baffles me, the amount of uneducated white people in particular that sit there and talk about how this flag represents anything other than prejudice, discrimination, segregation, and flat-out racism. It doesn't matter whether it was from the 1860s or the middle of the 20th century. It's still the same fucking thing. That's what it represents. It represents racism, segregation, discrimination, subjugation of an entire race of people. And to me, as far as I'm concerned, the people that support this flag and continue to want to, let's say, fly it over their house, put it on their motorcycles, or sit there and wear it on their shirts, they can do it. They have the constitutional right to do it. But when they do it, they either show how uninformed and uneducated they are, or they show that they don't care and that they support a treasonous, traitorous former country, if you will, and support things like segregation and racism. You can't spin it any other way. I hear idiots like Kid Rock talk about Southern pride. This dipshit's from the fucking Midwest as a multiracial son, and he's sitting there protesting against the taking down of the Confederate flag. Ding dong, dumb dick! The hell do you think that flag represents? The fuck are you talking about Southern pride and Southern history and Southern heritage? You can't pick and choose, because frankly, if you pick and choose, the only Southern history, Southern pride, and Southern heritage that abortion and abomination of a freaking flag represents is racism. It's segregation. It's subjugation. Should it fly in museums? Absolutely, because it is a part of this nation's history. Should it fly at Civil War battlefields? Absolutely, because again, it's a part of this nation's history. It helps tell that story. Should people be allowed to fly it at their own house? Wear it on their shirts? Put it on their vehicles? Absolutely, if that's what they choose to do. But flying it over publicly funded places? Absolutely not. Especially because at the end of the day, no matter how bad and imperfect this country is, this is ultimately the United States of America, not the Confederate States of America. Ding dong, dumb dicks, the Civil War ended 150 fucking years ago. It's time we stop celebrating the Civil War like it was some great thing. It's time we stop celebrating that flag and any representation of the Confederacy by continuing to fly it over state capitals and courthouses all throughout this freaking country. At the end of the day, there is no flag, in my opinion, in the history of perhaps this country or any country that could be more closely identified with racial oppression and segregation and discrimination and subjugation of people and horrible things than the Stars and Bars. Well, except the Stars and Stripes. But at the end of the day, the Union won the Civil War. And this is the United States of America. And with all the horrible things that the Stars and Stripes represents, it is the nation's flag. The Stars and Bars are not.